that. And it's good to see everybody again as we continue to study the Bible in our journey together. Of course, we've come to what Christians believe is the central part of the biblical narrative, the story of Jesus Christ. And we believe Jesus is the protagonist of the whole narrative, the hero of the story, if you will, or to break out of the literary metaphor, the savior of the world. But what's interesting is that once we get to this part of the story, unlike the book of Genesis at the beginning or the book of Revelation at the end, we don't just have one single authoritative account telling us what happened and what it means. Instead, we have four different accounts, all of which are telling us basically the same story. Sure, some of them bring in some details and focus on different parts than others, but they're all telling the narrative that begins with John's baptism and ends with Jesus being resurrected from the dead. So why have four? Well, as we said last week, even though they're telling the same set of events, each gospel writer seems to have some unique appreciation or idea about what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah and what way Jesus brought salvation. And so Matthew, for example, wanted to connect Jesus with the Older Testament. He wanted to show that Jesus was carrying on the very traditions, the very values of the people who went before him. That, in fact, everything that happened in Jesus's life was an echo of or was preceded by similar events in the Older Testament. But when we get to the Gospel of Mark, Mark wants to make almost the opposite point. Because Mark certainly would agree that Jesus is a part of this great Jewish tradition, but he wants to emphasize that Jesus is something different. Jesus is something new. Yes, there had been others in the Bible who were heroes, and Jesus is a hero like their heroes, but not of the same kind. There have been others who were prophets before Jesus, but Jesus had a different kind of revelation. To quote the crowds in Mark chapter 2, after he heals a paralytic, they say, "We have never seen anything like this." Jesus is doing something absolutely new. Now, this may sound like it's contradicting Matthew, but it's really not. It's really just two different sides of the same answer. Both of them are responding to the Jewish exile. The Jews had for centuries been in this very confusing situation in which God seemed to abandon them. And they asked, why? Well, Matthew wants to emphasize that no, God has not abandoned you. God is carrying on your hopes and your dreams and your future in Jesus. And Mark wouldn't disagree with that, but Mark wants to acknowledge, you know what? It is hard to understand. It does seem, at least, like God is absent. But there's a reason for it. There is a plan. It's just been hidden. God does have a purpose for allowing all this and working through all this, but it's kind of like a secret. But finally, when Jesus comes, when the time has been fulfilled, this mystery of the ages will be unveiled, and Jesus will give us the secret to salvation. But not immediately. Because if you read the Gospel of Mark, you find that although Jesus does publicly reveal who he is and his mission by the end of the book, he spends more time in the first part of the book trying to conceal who he is than he does trying to reveal who he is. And this is really odd, and yet it's everywhere. It's hard to deny. So, for example, in Jesus' very first miracle, when he goes into a synagogue and begins preaching, there is a demon-possessed man who shows up and begins challenging him. And this is the interaction that we have from Mark chapter 1 between Jesus and this man. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." Now, we probably aren't that surprised that Jesus would rebuke a demon or order him to come out, but it seems like Jesus is trying to keep the demon from talking, from letting people know that he's the Holy One of God, whatever that means. Like, this is some great secret. And in case we have any doubts that this is what's going on, we hear at a few verses later in Mark chapter 1 that he did this many times. He would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Well, that's very strange. But it doesn't just stop with the demons. When Jesus is healing people who have other types of ailments, he also requires their silence. So, for example, in this interaction that he has with a man whom he cures from leprosy, these are the instructions that he gives them afterwards. He says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Say nothing to anyone. Jesus doesn't want the secret getting out. He doesn't want people to know that he is this powerful, miraculous person, the Holy One of God. And in the cases of Jesus's most extreme miraculous encounters, for example, when he raises a young girl from the dead, when he goes on a mountain and he actually has a conversation with Moses and Elijah, he only takes his 3 most trusted disciples with them, and he makes them swear to secrecy. Odd, right? And the same thing is true in his teaching when it comes to the parables. Now, when we think about Jesus's parables, we often think of them as these analogies that offer really great insights of profound spiritual truths and these simple stories that we can understand. And that's not entirely wrong. Jesus is teaching profound truths through these stories. But the fact that we think they are easy to understand just reveals our own context. Almost inevitably, whenever we hear a parable, whether we're reading it in our Bible or hearing it in church or in some kind of children's story or presentation, it almost always comes with an explanation. We're told what it means. But when Jesus originally gave his parables, he didn't give the crowds an explanation. In fact, parables mean riddles. He leaves them wondering. Now, he does explain it to his disciples later, as you can see from this passage here, but he makes the point even stronger, that to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand. Why? Why in the world would Jesus want to keep this a secret, right? This goes against the very grain of what we've been taught. We're supposed to go out and teach the good news, tell as many people as possible, make it known. So why is Jesus keeping this so hidden? Well, biblical scholars have a term for this question. It's called the Messianic secret. And although we find some elements in all of the Gospels, it really has its roots and its strongest presence in the Gospel of Mark. And there are a number of different explanations over the years that scholars have put forth as to why Jesus would try to keep his identity and his message so secretive. Just To be honest with you, there are some really cynical scholars out there who argue that the reason that Jesus said this is because he never actually claimed to be the Messiah. These Gospels, after all, were written by his followers, not Jesus, and they wanted to pretend that he was the Messiah, so they lied and said that he told them he was only when they were in secret. Well, this has been widely rejected by the scholarly community. There are a lot of reasons for this, but I think one of the glaring ones is that by the end of the book, Jesus very publicly says, I'm the Messiah, right? He acknowledges it. So I don't find this to be too persuasive. Now, there are others who say that maybe this is just kind of like a literary technique, right? Like you are reading a story, maybe the Odyssey, or maybe you think of a modern story, and there's this element of someone having a secret identity or something being hidden, and it builds the suspense, and then finally at the right moment, it's revealed. And there's something to be said about this. There's certainly something engaging about building suspense, about a mystery novel, a mystery movie where you're waiting to see what the secret's going to be. But there's always a risk in doing this because it's human nature to be more fascinated by the puzzle than by the solution. And so in the majority of cases, if you're reading a mystery novel, you're watching a show, by the time you finally get to the resolution, it tends to be a little disappointing. And it seems to me that there's a risk of this happening. The fact that it does happen to some people, that we might suggest that Jesus is this great, wonderful character, that he has the key to salvation, the key to their needs. Once they find out what it is, kind of brush it aside and say, that's not what I was looking for. This is disappointing. But I don't really think that it's just a literary technique either. I think that Jesus had a reason for wanting to be secretive about his identity and his mission. And an analogy that I can think of is with a Renaissance painter named Giotto di Bonfim. Now, Giotto was one of the great artists of the Renaissance. He's not as well known as Michelangelo or Da Vinci or some of those others, but many people believe that he was the first person to move from the stylistic types of painting that you had in the medieval era, where everybody was supposed to conform to a certain form or prototype, to the more realistic types of painting of the Renaissance. And so he was a radical guy. He was willing to do some radical things. He was a shepherd from a shepherd's family, but decided to be a painter. So that already is a big move. And then once he did come under an apprenticeship, he wasn't painting in the ways that you were supposed to be painting. He was drawing these realistic paintings and pictures. And somehow, despite breaking these social conventions, he began to make a little bit of a name for himself. He began to have some hope that he could make it as an artist. And then the big opportunity came. The Pope was going to commission someone to paint a chapel. And at that time, this was the big win for an artist, right? There weren't a lot of opportunities for artists out there. There weren't art shows or street fairs or things like that. If you wanted to make it, you needed a big sponsor, and there was no greater sponsor. There was no greater fame that you could get than to do something for the church, for the Pope. So the Pope sends out a messenger, and this messenger is supposed to go and interview all of these potential artists, including Giotto, and ask them all to give a sample of their paintings so that the Pope can decide whether or not they are worthy of this project. Well, when they came to Giotto, instead of doing one of his typical realistic types of paintings, Giotto just made a circle and handed it to the messenger and said, if the Pope can appreciate this, then he is worthy of my services. Now, messenger is somewhat stunned by this, right? Like, why? How dare you think that you are greater than the Pope? And what do you mean you're just giving me a circle? This is laughable. You got to get me a real piece of art, a real sample that I can bring him. But Giotto refused. And so the messenger walked away, frustrated, kind of shuffling this picture toward the back of the stack, trying to decide what he's going to do when he has to show it to the Pope. Well, when the moment comes and he has all these paintings that he's getting ready to present to the Pope immediately notices the one that's just a circle. And he says, what's this? And the messenger says, I'm sorry, it's this painter named Giotto, and he made this circle. And the Pope says, I know, and it's a perfect circle. What do you mean? You can't tell where the artist started or where the artist ended. Every point is equally distanced from the center. It's a perfect circle. That's not something you see very often. What kind of tool did he use to make this? Did he have a compass, or did he have his own device? And he said, well, no, he didn't have a device. He just made this by hand. The Pope said, by hand? I don't think I've ever seen somebody make something with such precision by hand before. That's amazing. Well, I bet you that took all day. He probably spent half the day just trying to make sure that each part of this circle was equally distanced from the center. How many drafts did you have to go through to get this one? I said, well, it only took him a couple of seconds. He just made this circle and handed it to me. The Pope realized that if somebody was skillful enough that he could so quickly produce a perfect circle, then he was the kind of person that he wanted to have painting the chapel. Now, what I appreciate about this story is that it raises some questions about who is evaluating whom, right? You typically assume in a story like this that the Pope is the one who's the judge, and that the artists are the ones who are supposed to perform for them. And so Giotto is supposed to prove to the Pope that he's good enough for him, and they go from there. But it doesn't quite work like that, because Giotto also has some expectations of the Pope. And that makes the work all the more meaningful. I think this is important for us because we are used to being in an age where everybody is constantly selling themselves to us, right? And churches fall into this same pattern too, whether it has to do with something religious or something in business or something political. We have people who are saying, look, you need to listen to my person and my view. Look at the awards that they've won, the books that they've sold. Imagine the effect that it's been. Just come and listen and give it a try, and you'll find out that this is really the right thing for you. Jesus isn't doing that. It's not that Jesus doesn't want us to be followers, but Jesus has some expectations for us as well. If we are going to hear this message, to be privy to this great secret, then we have to show that we are willing, serious about following Christ. There's a point in my own life when I remember a moment like this. I've talked often about my journey through doubt and a period of time when I was really struggling. And I remember there was a conversation that I had with a Christian person about different views, and that he made this idea and this suggestion, and I just kept shooting them down. No, I don't believe that. I don't believe this. That's not really very convincing. What else you got? Give me something persuasive. And the other person said to me, I don't think it works that way. I don't know what kind of God would be if she was just bending over backwards to try to convince you, Brian, of her reality, of her nature. I think you actually have to take some steps towards this to be able to see it. And that turned out to be true. There's a phrase that Jesus uses over and over in the Gospel of Mark in order to convey this. It's a short phrase that says, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." If we're going to be able to receive this great message, we have to have the ears to hear. Because Christianity isn't designed to be a consumer religion. It's not something where we sit there and we say, okay, I guess I accept that. And then all of a sudden you're saved, you're in, you're done. It's a journey. It's a step through faith. In fact, one wonders if part of the reason why the Bible is so complex and sometimes hard to understand is because God wants us to wrestle with it before we can really receive and appreciate the nature of this salvation. So as we engage this story, let's not just do so as consumers, but let's do so as people who are joining with Jesus and allowing this salvation to be revealed. May we have eyes to see and ears to hear what God has to say to us.